introduction. Is this working? You can hear me, great. So good afternoon, it's wonderful to be here. It was an honor to be invited to moderate this panel on symbolic reparations and advocacy, which I understand ties in well with the conversation earlier or before this panel. I must confess, I only just barely arrived from Boston. I had to get my little people off to their respective activities this morning, so I really regret missing that conversation, but I couldn't be more thrilled to be engaged in a conversation about reparations. As mentioned, it's been a topic that I've been working in for about 25 years as a scholar and practitioner, and mostly in Latin America, but not in the US. So this is all new for me, and I'm just really excited to be able to share some of that knowledge today. One of the significant ways that I've delved into the topic of symbolic reparations was when I was invited to be a member of the Symbolic Reparation Research Project, which was a group of scholars in the humanities and the legal world. And in this process of deliberating upon these principles, I gained a lot of insight into the role of symbolic reparations, not only for redress and acknowledgement and accountability, but also to guarantee principles of non-repetition and even transformation. So the experience working in reparations in that group and just in general in my practice has really led me to the conviction that it's not just the outcome, but the process, and that's where a lot of my work is now in terms of the expressive nature of truly engaging the beneficiaries in the process of developing reparations, and not just the outcome of reparations. I've even recently made a claim that it is a human right to be engaged in the process, a form of citizen restitution that actively engages those who are intended to benefit from these measures. So it's interesting because symbolic reparations doesn't always attract as much attention as, let's say, compensation, and that's why this whole event is really great, because it's looking specifically at memorialization and symbolic reparations, and there is a lot of great work being done. So the International Coalition of the Sites of Conscience, also the Auschwitz Institute for the Prevention of Genocide and Mass Atrocities just published a great toolkit that I just got about a week ago, so I only skimmed it, but it looks really amazing. So symbolic reparations deserves our attention, especially for the ever-growing movement in the US. And I'm happy to share that through the work of the Transitional Justice in the USA project, which I oversee, there is great symbolic reparation work being done. I'm sure a lot of the folks in the room today are engaged in some of those projects, but there's always more to be done. So I got my amazing students who are helping with our mapping project, and they've found about 90 truth and reparation initiatives across the country, mostly local, city and state. And what they came up with is only 7 explicitly call for symbolic reparations. So you can see there's a lot of work to be done. Many of the mandates include acknowledgement of the past, which is a form of symbolic reparations, but having really a dedicated focus on symbolic reparations requires that we put our mind to it, that it's explicit, and that we give guidance on how it should be done. So today offers an exciting opportunity for us to delve deeper into understanding not only what are symbolic reparations, but how do we make sure they're done well, right? Including making sure that those who should benefit from them are included in the process. So before we get into that conversation, I can't help myself as a law professor to give you a little bit of the global human rights framework. I even lifted my slides from how I teach it to my students. And so with the PowerPoint, we can go to the next one. I think it's really just important to emphasize that this is a human right? That international treaties not only protect our rights, our civil, political, economic, social, and cultural rights, they actually also protect the right to redress. It's a human right. And it's so important to frame it that way. And in fact, if we go to the next slide, and these are just a list of some of the main human rights treaties, and we could find this specific article, but that's the class, so you can go ahead and do that. But what's important to keep in mind is there's many forms of reparation. There's compensation, there's rehabilitation, but where symbolic reparations falls is usually something called satisfaction, but the argument can be made, and we should make it, that it's also a form of non-repetition. Now, these are recognized by international courts, like the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, based in Costa Rica, and also the Commission based in DC, not far from here, as well as the UN Basic Principles. I'm not going to go through the full title, you can see it up there, but it is an important document which actually is kind of a guideline to reparations and understanding it. And it very much says, we are not just saying this is important, we are just writing down what it already exists as customary law, right? So an important guidance. Next slide. So one of the things to keep in mind is that when we're thinking about reparations, there's different dimensions, right? So there's the individual dimension of a person might receive reparations for the specific harm that they are able to prove either in court, right? So that's some ways that reparations are delivered, or through reparation programs. And then there's also the symbolic, and it can be individual as well. It may be an apology letter, but this can also be at the collective level, right? So the symbolic collective measures, which is a big part of today's conversation, is important for understanding the complexity, right? So the UN calls for the complexity when we talk about reparations. Again, and if you could go to the next slide, what's interesting is the UN Basic Principles don't actually have a category on symbolic reparations. They call it satisfaction, just technically, but it also doesn't just involve what we may think of as a statute, right? That it can be a lot of different measures. It can be apologies, but it can be processes of engaging in communities in conversation. It can be documentaries. It can be all kinds of measures, right? But it's important to consider what makes it symbolic reparations. So I want to end there with just that framework to get us started with our conversation with our wonderful panelists. And I was instructed that their bios are available to you, but just as a really quick introduction, first, Bibby, who I understand has done some amazing work looking at spaces, Black spaces, as an architect. And his current role is at the National Trust for Historic Preservation. Amazing work, and I can't wait to hear more. In our planning call, it was fascinating. And Professor Jill Bryant, who is serving currently as Associate Provost, I'm sorry, I'm getting this wrong, because you have a new role, right? Yeah. Vice Dean at Mitchell Hamline Law School. She's done a lot of work in corporate law as both a practitioner and a scholar, and is doing some fascinating research now with related to the work of business and reparations. So to get us started, Bibby, it would be great to just hear a little bit about your work, and each speaker will talk for about 5 to 7 minutes, and then I have some questions, and then we'll open it up to the audience for questions. So thank you.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Good evening, everyone. Good evening. All right, my name is Brandon Bibby. I go by Bibby. You can go ahead and go to the next slide, but the reason that I do that is because I am the son of Dee and Frankie Bibby, and I enter the work that I do. The only reason that I'm able to do the work that I do and access all of me is because I'm doing it in honor of them. So that's why I go by Bibby. But that goes into how I got into preservation. So I'm an architect. I work in historic preservation, also cultural preservation, specifically in Black and African American space. And so this is the neighborhood where I grew up in. It's Rock Island in El Dorado, Arkansas, between the Delta and the Plains. It's your typical African American neighborhood that's been suffered from lack of investment, from policies that allow for industry to encroach on the neighborhood. So I grew up, my home is right there. I was a 2-minute walk down to Miles Memorial Church of God in Christ. But also a 5-minute walk is oil refineries, there were poultry plants, there are chemical plants, everything that even from a young age I knew was impacting my community and my space. But I was really fascinated by why no one else seemed to actually care, why everyone was content with living the way that, was just the everyday. So I started in dance. My mom was like, you're not gonna make money doing dance, so choose something else. So I found that architecture used a lot of the same language that I had learned as a child in dance in terms of space and movement and place. So that's how I found architecture. And it was an opportunity for me to actually make a difference and make Black space, like the one that I grew up in, better. So that's how I got into architecture. That's how I got into working specifically in African American spaces. But why this place is important is because it is my passion project. It is something that every project that I'm working on teaches me something that I can bring back to this place. 2 years ago, I lost my mom from COVID, and part of why I was super passionate about doing architecture is because my great-granddad built the house that we lived in and that we grew up in, and she had so much pride in that little 3-room home that doesn't look like much, but there's a reason why my family chose not to leave it. And so I kind of told myself that if she's not going to move out, I'm going to make it the best place that I can. But unfortunately, I was too late before the impacts of places like this get to our community. So when our places aren't built for us to heal, that's unfortunately the reality that so many Black communities live in. But that's inspiring me to not let that continue to happen. And I'm fortunate now to be in a position where I'm working in communities all across the country that look exactly like this place. Some look a little bit different, but the origin stories might be different, but the realities are just the same. And so I'm in a position now where I get to bring 100% of myself, my Black self, to the work, and that's really, really rewarding. And I thank Brent Leggs, who's the executive director of the African American Cultural Heritage Action Fund, for creating the vision to support Black preservation, because it created a position for a Black professional like me to be in this space and to do this work that I didn't think would even be possible. So next slide. So I'm fortunate to work all across the country, but the reason why Miles Memorial Church of God in Christ is important is because this is Robert's Temple, Church of God in Christ, where Emmett Till's funeral was held in 1955. And this is one of the projects that I get to project management with our great architects over there, with Mass Design Group, Jadi and Bethel, who are leading the community engagement for the project. But this is an example of a project that I get to bring my Kojic self, a child that grew up in the Church of God in Christ. The first day that I entered the room, everyone was like, all the elders were like, "Your name's Bibby? Like, you know Emily?" I was like, "Yes, ma'am, that's my grandmother." So now they call me Emily's grandson, because my grandmother was a gospel singer that traveled around. So that's the kind of community that I'm fortunate enough to be in. But why this is important is I think that the story of Emmett Till is one of the rare examples of reparations in progress in the United States. It started with symbolic reparations in terms of an apology from the state, from the city, finally apologizing to the family. But letters and words are very shallow. They jumpstart things, but it's up to the material reparations to follow through. But going back to the process being important, seeing communities who have literally looked at their neighbors with caution, like my neighbor's always got an ulterior motive sort of mentality, seeing them finally work together is a part of healing, and that is the reparations. Like, reparations is repair. And without repair, there is no reparation. It's just a memorial, it's just a letter, it's just a statement. So we're constantly thinking about what is the repair in the project. And in this case, it's communities coming together, working to reconcile racial traumas that have lasted for a long time, families realizing histories that they've literally forced themselves to forget because they are painful. They're things that to them weren't real, they weren't true, but even though they were, because over time we force ourselves as a trauma response to forget. So remembering is a big part of the reparations work. And in this case, at Robert's Temple, the church had undergone multiple changes in terms of the physical building. There was a 1990s restoration that changed the facade of the church and everything, and it was because the church wanted a new image of themselves, a new vision for themselves. But then the memorial, the Emmett Till memorial work all started to happen, and so the team at the time was thinking about how does Robert's Temple come into the sort of repair work? What can we do to preserve this site as a cultural landmark? And so now we are taking the exterior and the interior sanctuary back to what it looked like in 1955. And so that's what we call a period of significance in historic preservation. So 1955 being the period of this photograph that was taken right there. So if you drive by now, the 1990s facade has already been removed, and the team's in the process of repairing the exterior to look just like this photo. But what's beautiful about the team that's working together is our project partner, Dr. Parker, who's with the organization in Mississippi. She's the wife of Reverend Wheeler Parker, who was the last living witness to Emmett Till. He's the cousin of Emmett Till. But she was very intentional about creating a community of memory to steward the project. And that means the Roberts family, whose story has been overlooked in terms of Emmett Till's story, but they are the family that started this church in Bronzeville, Chicago. They were a family that provided food, provided shelter for immigrants from Mississippi who were escaping the trauma to move up north during the Great Migration. So how do you tell their stories? And she was very specific about creating a community of memory that were elders that remembered 1955. So that required people that had left the church for decades and generations to come back and to actually remember what it's like to sit in the pulpit, to be a child, to experience this trauma, and letting that guide the actual preservation work. So I'll leave that there and hand it off to Jill.
Yeah. First, thank you, Bibby, for sharing such a personal story. It's very impactful. I appreciate that. Thank you for having me here. And I feel like my work isn't so emotional. But I came to this work after over 15 years of corporate practice. I am an attorney representing corporate America. I moved to the academy and continue to write about the things that you would expect corporate attorneys and what corporate business folks want to see and to hear. And then several years ago, I had the pleasure of reading Douglas Blackmon's book and then watching the documentary of Slavery by Another Name. And it impacted me, as I told him earlier, in ways that I hadn't anticipated. And the book, as you know, documents convict leasing in this country. And what fascinated me and what has me on this current journey is what happened to all those corporations? What happened to all of those entities that engaged in this practice that made so much money? And Douglas Blackmon touches on some of this in the book. And so I started on this journey of how can I find the companies? How can I find what has happened to them? And then what? And as an attorney, I knew the actual legal remedies would be difficult. I have brainstormed and workshopped various ideas with other attorneys and colleagues, and there are kernels of ideas there. But because this is a complex problem and complex in terms of a legal remedy, I finally concluded that complex problems have complex solutions. And what typically happens with a legal remedy is that there's a moral shift that has to occur before a legal remedy is even found or contemplated. And so I've decided to open up my thinking about what's possible. And so that's what leads me to what I call slight cracks in the dam of reparations, memorialization, as ways of not repeating, but as ways of laying the groundwork for legal remedies at some other point. These are difficult things to do because these are private companies, some that no longer exist, some that have been bought by other private companies, some that have been bought by public companies, but also because we have laws, in addition to our Constitution, we have state laws that permit convict leasing, and we now have private-public coordination and partnerships that basically memorialize convict leasing. And so it's a long journey, but one that I'm happy to be on, and one that I'm hopeful once we get to the point where we can shine a light on the role of corporations in profiting from convict leasing, that will have change. And so I feel like I'm at door one of the journey.
And likewise, thank you for sharing your journey and what brought you to your work. So I have some questions that I hope we can just have a conversation, and some of this is exploratory, and we can take it where it goes, and maybe the audience will be able to contribute once we've asked a few questions. But I feel like based on what you already shared, I want to jump to the question of how do we ensure the success of reparations, right? Especially symbolic reparations, and what are some of the challenges of implementing reparations based on your thinking, your experience? How do we know when it's done well?
In the context of holding private companies responsible, I suppose the simplest measure of success is that someone writes a check. The legal guard jargon is their damages. I don't think we will see that. I could be wrong. I'd like to be wrong. What I'd like to see as a measure of success is an acknowledgement of what leads you to your wealth that you have now. An acknowledgement that current wealth was built on the back of terrific harm to a whole generation of African American families, individual families and communities. And we can directly see the harms, particularly in the communities where African American men were after the Civil War just snatched off the street. Though that harm is still there, yet the value and generational wealth that the families of these private company owners, some of them continue to be wealthy, not necessarily all of them, but that wealth is still there. And so an acknowledgement of that harm and what it really means when you say that, we just built this company from the ground. Well, you built it from the ground, but you also trampled generations of families in the process of building that company from the ground. And I'd like an acknowledgement of that. I don't even need a check. I'd like for you to know that you've done that.
Yeah, and I'll say that reparations in general in an American context is really complicated, especially if we are trying to use the international models based off of what's been successful there, because America at its inception is different.
Yeah.
The sort of idea of a country that's built on the division of race is unlike anywhere else, and we're here nearing 500 years later, whereas other people have tackled it, like South Africa, pretty recently. So when you have different levels of things that need repair, it's not just forced labor, it's forced labor that led to divisions of wealth, that led to policies that, have continued to push certain people down.
Right.
So in terms of successful reparations, again, it's in the word repair. Like if there is no repair, then there's no successful reparation. And to add more complexity to it, you think about, yes, the solution to reparations could be, for example, in Mississippi, if the state were to say, we apologize for all the trauma to Black individuals that led to you and your families leaving this place. So, here's land to come back, to cultivate, to do these things. But that was never your land to give me to begin with. So you have levels of indigenous history that also has to be addressed with African American reparations. So I think it's a really complex thing. And honestly, I don't know that we would see successful reparations in America in a very long time.
So it's interesting because there is the claim, not just looking at monetary reparations, but symbolic reparations as contributing to this idea of non-repetition, right? So in Latin America, it's nunca más, never again. There's this idea that a lot of this work isn't just the repair for the individual, but also to make sure that a society doesn't go through new cycles of harm. How do you envision your work, symbolic reparations, contributing to this idea of non-repetition and even more transformation, if that's possible?
I know you sent that question ahead of time, and I wanted to have a really good, positive answer. And I was hoping you wouldn't ask that question, because I don't have a really good, positive answer. I don't think it will lead to not repetition. And the reason is because I started this work on convict leasing, looking at the corporate history of it and trying to follow the corporations about 2 years ago. And it essentially, convict leasing started after the Civil War. And 160 years later, we're still talking about it. It has changed. It has morphed into something else. It still involves private companies, but it's not what it used to be. And you would have thought that at some point in 160 years, which is short compared to the history of slavery, that non-repetition would have happened there, because a light would shine on it and things would change and there'd be uproar. And then we moved through the civil rights era, but we still have it. And so I'm not as hopeful. I want to be hopeful. I'd like to think I live my life on a personal level as a positive individual. But this is about power and money. And when you involve power and money, you don't have non-repetition. You have something new that occurs that people think is different, but it's the same.
And I guess to address the part of the question that's specific to my work in historic preservation is the ability for a community to see value in the assets that they do have ownership of, and to leverage that to their benefit, leverage that to economic development, leverage it to tourism in a way that they're not relying on a corporation or someone else to write them a check to do. Seeing them, claim the value of their place, and wanting to invest in it is, a success in its own. But in terms of non-repetition, I think it gives future generations a lens of what's possible, even if things don't change. Like the reality that African Americans have had to adapt from the time that we were brought to America, and that's been a part of the culture, how the culture has evolved and changed. That's how buildings were built, reclaiming spaces that were never truly made for us, but we adapted.
Yeah.
It's that message that leads to we can do it if it does repeat. Not that it won't repeat, but that there's a way out of it because my grandparents, the generations before us found a way, so I can find a way.
Yeah, when it repeats, I know how to. Yeah.
So what I'm hearing is that part of non-repetition is empowering communities to be able to fight against repetition, which is a form of non-repetition, but it just leads me to think about our expectations of reparations, especially symbolic reparations. And as I mentioned, working in the symbolic reparation research project, and these are theoretical principles, right? There's often more negative examples than positive examples. So I share your wanting to be hopeful, but recognizing the challenge. But one of the things that I have thought a lot about and wonder is the narrative that accompanies these measures, right? So a part of our struggle currently in the country, especially with the ridiculousness of the DEI attack and all these narratives, and they're allowed to continue because there's not the historical context and most people don't know about it. And so it's out of nowhere, right? And so a part of my thinking is, how do we create more knowledge and context so that there can be more resistance to this other narrative? So how do you see your work or your exploration as potentially contributing to this counter narrative that we so desperately need here?
That's actually really important. Shining a light helps people know. So I think, by way of example, and these aren't necessarily the companies involved, but if you know that U.S. Steel was involved in purchasing companies that engaged in conflict leasing, it's a tool in your tool belt of information that helps you get something from U.S. Steel if you need something. There are many different strands of the companies involved. Some of them were actually engaged in conflict leasing. Others of them were financing some of the deals that brought the convicts in. So, for example, if you know that a certain bank was involved in the financing of it. So it's things like that about having symbolic memorialization mattering to the people that were harmed, because it shines a light on the history for you to be empowered. It might be that the light only shines for a while, but it's a way for you to pass something on to your next generation that empowers the next generation.
And can you repeat the end of that question?
Just in terms of, how do symbolic reparations potentially contribute to a counter narrative to challenge some of what is currently being taken as an attack against current policies which don't acknowledge the history behind them?
Yeah, I think, I don't know how to say it in a non-proper way, but the fight to get rid of Black history in elementary classes and high school courses and things like this, what we're seeing is, by giving our communities their spaces back that held those histories, they don't have to rely on the books to get the kids the information. Like, if they can rely on telling their stories and connecting them to other places, then it's in the lived experience of the child in a way that can't be taken away from. You can't force a kid to not go to church with their parents. So if the church has a history class, then they're going to learn about history. They don't have to wait for them to go to school. So that's what we're seeing, is a lot of, in terms of adaptive reuse of the buildings that people are reclaiming for preservation, is they're thinking about them in that way. How do I fit the need of my community where they're not being met? Like, what services can I provide? And most of the time, that's our Black churches, who are historically the anchor of our communities anyway. So we're trying to get them collectively to think about, membership is down, people aren't coming to church. If they are, they're going virtually. But how do you become that anchor that we need again, in a way that's not relying on somebody to necessarily, share the same religious mission of you, but you're providing food, you're providing shelter, you're providing welfare like you used to. So there's those opportunities again, if we were to reclaim our space.
So it's interesting. So again, recognizing that reparations is for the repair of the individual. And I see that our time is to soon turn to the audience, but I struggle with the idea sometimes that reparations, especially symbolic reparations, that are in the community of the people that are harmed, have such great value in terms of repair and acknowledgement. But then you have the rest of the society, and quite frankly, I belong to the rest of the society, and I know many of them don't know about this, right? So one of the purposes of symbolic reparations is to bring the rest of everybody along. So what I'm hearing is more the first form of repair. What do you think about the
But not
second
everyone
part?
wants to come along. And you assume that if I do something that's a symbolic form of reparation, that sure, it will benefit me because I was harmed, but you may not want to come along. And I don't need you to repair me.
And that's, just to jump in on that, that's what I hear
Yep.
a lot is either people don't want you to repair me or you don't have to tell me that
Yep.
I'm like, I have trauma. Like, don't tell me that.
Right.
Like, I don't need to remember. So that's part of what the problem that we're facing is
Right.
part of the country wants reparations, other part just wants to live and continue to progress in reparation. They don't see reparations as the answer for that reason that,
Yep.
you can do it, but those other people with the power and the policies aren't going to change
But
anything.
it's the reason I want to focus on entities, because entities have black workers, they have brown workers, it matters. It might only last 5 minutes, but if you can put the kind of pressure that you need there by shining a light on this is the history of this entity, the light shines for a little while.
Right, and so empowering local communities
Empowering the
just
community.
to continue with their
Yeah.
story is the resistance to the counter narrative.
Yes.
So I know that we have limited time, but I really do want to ask Bibby about how you engage local communities in your work, because it's so vital and amazing from what you told me. If you could share a little bit about what that looks like and how you know if you've successfully engaged beneficiaries in that process. What does it look like?
Yeah, I think one of the mottos that we like to work in is that, the solution is already in the community. Like they already have the answers. And so not going in as an expert, not going in as an architect, not going in as a historian, but as someone who just listens and letting them tell the stories that they don't remember by showing them a photograph and then being like, oh, yeah, my grandma used to take me there. I remember, this. And then asking them questions like, well, do you remember what it looked like? Like, oh, yeah, it was a red door right there. And like those sort of memories and seeing the joy that comes out of that is a joy that most people haven't experienced in a really, really long time. So that's part of the, I guess, reward. But again, just when working with the community, not assuming that you know everything about the community, but letting them lead. And I don't know if that's the same thing I said last time, but.
Q&A? No. Keep going? Great. Okay. I got mixed messages with my signage there. So, so one thing for Julia in particular is, so business and human rights is a current movement, and they are, those who are engaged in looking at business accountability are looking at current examples of enforced labor, but how is that framework helpful for engaging businesses in actually being a part of a reparation movement? Do you think that's going to happen? Is that possible?
I think it's possible. And I sort of think it depends on the degree of harm that the business entity you can document the degree of harm. And the more you can show that, the more possible things become. So for example, many people know that J.P. Morgan, the current J.P. Morgan, the original J.P. Morgan was heavily involved in insuring slave property. And it's a large part of the wealth of the entity J.P. Morgan, not just the individual family members. How do you bring that forward now for a public company like J.P. Morgan to acknowledge that and to own that?
How do you do that?
Well, it's not a secret that J.P. Morgan financed the slave trade, or that they insured, were involved in companies that insured them. The issue is it needs to matter to us, because it's an open secret. It's not something it's like the color of money. I mean, it was easy for him to research that book because all of the stuff was just available for people to find. So it needs to matter to us, and so the story needs to be known to African Americans so that we can bring pressure on J.P. Morgan. And you can bring pressure on J.P. Morgan now in the context of DEI and hiring people of color, but it needs to be a pressure about redressing harm that damages. This is the damage that was caused.
So public pressure as
Public
opposed
pressure.
to a legal claim, which is the work
Yes,
that you were...
that's difficult, the actual legal claim, but the public pressure.
And it's also empowering communities to know where to find those resources, like who holds the documents. Like a lot of records are at universities. Do you know which university this corporation's information is at? Going back to the map that I showed, you know, Murphy Oil, if you've ever gotten your gas at Walmart, is based in El Dorado. They're the oil plants that are all around my community. So getting my neighbors and my cousins, can you research like what, you know, their history, and how can you leverage that to have a formal apology? Because it's a neighborhood just like many others that was majority slaves. Like the number of slaves outnumbered the number of white people. So that's how the Black community evolved. There's got to be history about how the land happened, all of these stories that these corporations have hidden that need to be uncovered. And if communities can do that, they have more power than someone from the outside coming in and just writing a story or writing a research paper. But if they hold the knowledge, then they can actually get things done.
And newspaper articles are powerful because at the moment that all these things were happening, it wasn't like people were ashamed of the fact that they were using Black labor in harmful ways. It was, sure, yeah, we did this. It's public knowledge, it's common knowledge. So it's easier to find that.
And so there's a process of revealing the practices of companies, but at the end of the day, if they're just acknowledging and apologizing, is that enough?
No.
What more might need to happen?
It's not enough, but it's a start. And that's where I had to come to on my own research. It's not enough, but it has to be a start. Because otherwise, if you don't start, then you don't even get to whatever it is your own prize might be. Yeah. It's a start.
But in terms of like the built environment, if you know where the research information is, and you know the statistics of your community who has high rates of high blood pressure, high rates of cancers, and things that historically we have been told are genetic to us, but really they are environmental.
Yep.
Then the repair, once that information is public, is how are you investing in medical care for Black communities? How are you investing in soil treatment plants that are repairing the soils that are beneath these communities? Like, those are the conversations that lead to the repair, but you have to empower the community to want to find that information.
The ACLU and the University of Chicago, one of their law school human rights clinic, put out a report 2 years ago now that talks about the current convict leasing system now. And someone alluded to this, that involving current fast food companies, current poultry companies, current businesses of names that we know, is a $2 billion business. on the backs of, this is what we know now. Okay, and that's not hidden, but it needs to be common knowledge in the community. If you know that convict leasing now is a $2 billion industry.
Last question. I think we're at the limit, but just, it's interesting because you talk about the U.S. being different, and there is an argument among us internationalists of the exceptionalism of the U.S., and I could have a conversation afterwards about some of the parallels, but one of the things that is interesting is that seeking a remedy through a judicial process, as you know, is hard.
It's hard.
It's a lot of money. It takes forever.
Yeah.
But all these initiatives are what are called administrative reparation programs. And so do you see a role for business in your work, have businesses played a role in underwriting the work of these local initiatives? Is there space for that kind of engagement with businesses in repair?
There is a space. Most public companies now, although not required to, end up putting out a corporate social responsibility report. And so there is a space where companies that care about corporate social responsibility can go there either through financial support or just making known of certain things. And you see some of the companies do focus on human rights as part of their corporate social responsibility.
Well,
Business engagement. Have you had any businesses underwrite your work?
Businesses, not necessarily, but I think there is the potential for it. In rural cases, we have seen communities who, there are newer generation who are realizing their family's history and harm, wanting to do something about repair. So they're using, funds that they've acquired from their family to actually give back to preservation efforts and things like that. So corporations could do the same in terms of funding some of the development that needs to happen.
We do have one question over here.
So my understanding is the mic will be, yes. And I think maybe introducing yourself and asking your question, and if it's to a particular person, letting us know.
I think it's to both the panelists, Jill and to Bibby. My name is Stephanie Armistead, Atlanta resident, come out of corporate sustainability, and I wanted to take the conversation a little further than just CSR reporting.
Yep.
Recently, the SEC just layered on another dimension of climate disclosures for publicly traded companies. So 15 years ago, the investment community for impact investments we're just beginning to ask companies to disclose and to make financial recommendations to their retail investment community about those companies that were doing wonderful work in the built environment or human rights and so forth. So how might we then take that ESG model where companies are either utilizing the science-based targets, global reporting initiative, carbon disclosure project, and reach to the financial community and say, okay, JP Morgan, Morgan Stanley, Fidelity, we want added into this disclosure statement more than a box to check, but what is your plan for reparations? What have you financially contributed to? And what is your path forward? And then hold them accountable in the public space, because having worked with a private company, what you learn very quickly is what a public company is held under the microscope for, begins to eventually, from a reputation standpoint, turns also to the private community or private companies. So I would invite us to consider how might we approach the investment community and ask them to include that on a financial disclosure report.
The example you gave is a good one, because I would not have guessed that the SEC would have moved in the direction that it did. And it's to my kind of simple point, you have to kind of start somewhere to get to the point that the SEC agreed. I didn't think they ever would. In terms of going to other entities, as you know, for public companies, it's the shareholders who get to move these initiatives. And every year, at least with Apple, there's a group of shareholders who push a move to have Apple disclose more and more about its own efforts at diversity. And it's the exact same initiative that comes up every year, and it gets voted down. But the point is that it has to come from the shareholders every single year. And that's the kind of initiative that it's going to take. Even if it's repetitive, it gets voted down, it comes back at some point, and I think, what, did it take 20 years for this to happen? It did happen when now you have to make those disclosures.
Yeah. And it doesn't just have to come from shareholders.
Correct.
It can also come from.
It can, from those that have been harmed. You're gonna need a strong ally in the shareholders, because those are the ones that are eventually gonna have to put the real pressure on. But that's where it starts. And that's what the community knowing that what the harm is, to be able to name it.
Thank you. Gael Zaimana, the Carter Center. I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with Dr. Sandy Darity at Duke. He's a leading economist who works on reparations.
Yep.
And he is of the view that any reparations that don't address or shrink the racial wealth gap are considered essentially performative. So I was just wondering maybe you guys could speak to that. And then also, if, I forgot, this form of reparations that we're talking to about today are necessary or complement monetary reparations, what is being, like, what rules or guidelines are being put in place to ensure that it's not conflated with monetary reparations?
Mm.
Just repeat the first part of your question. He says what?
Essentially, any reparations that don't address the racial wealth gap, essentially he's calculated the racial wealth gap is around $16 trillion.
$60 trillion,
and
right.
Exactly. So if any policies or reparation policies that don't shrink that, or he considers them performative. And he's actually opposed to the piecemeal reparations in Evanston and similar other cities that are performing. So just wondering if you can hear your thoughts on that.
I mean, I just think it's interesting that the panel is about symbolic reparations, and we pretty quickly deviated away from that.
Because it's where I came to. It's all of them. It's not just one. So maybe you started symbolic reparations, and that leads you to something else. But I get the passion around one form. But I had to even come to the point, because I think when I started this work, I was like, well, we're going to come up with some kind of legal remedy for damages, because I think of reparations, I think of damages. And it's hard, to time-consuming, to it's almost impossible. And so I have come to change my thinking that it has to be multifaceted, it has to start in different ways. The beginning doesn't have to be in symbolic reparations, so that's not ground zero. It might be, in some instances, stage 5, and it looks different in different industries. I'm more interested in holding private and public companies accountable, so it'll look different in that space than it might look in another space. But it's all of those things, and it's also, to me, slightly dangerous with a lowercase d and all lowercase letters, not yelling at you dangerous. To want to pit various forms of reparation against each other, as though if I don't have monetary, I can't have symbolic, or symbolic is less than monetary. Because it causes the folks that you're looking to benefit to bicker over the end result, when what you want is to start the conversation, to move it. If it takes 20 years, if it takes 25 years, if you started bickering, you don't get anywhere.
And I think the general public assumes reparations means financial.
Yes.
And that's a big part of the...
Yeah.
And just to the basic principles that I shared with you earlier, the UN, they are UN guidelines on reparation programs, and comparatively speaking, of some 60 countries around the world that have gone through a similar process, although arguably not about historical wrongs, but it's always all measures.
Right.
Because just like some, saying that symbolic reparations is soft. Some who would say, so for example, in Latin America, money was seen as blood money for paying for your silence. So the risk of just payment is the same, that the history is not being acknowledged, that there's not continued efforts to raise awareness, to acknowledge past harms. And so one of the important things about symbolic reparations is that it is a way to ensure that money isn't just paid for the silence of the past. And again, it's usually just like the slide on the complexity that the UN advises. It would be short-sighted to just do one form of reparations and not consider the other forms. But you have to start somewhere.
Right.
Can't hear me? There we are. My name is Adria Kitchens. I'm with the Out of Hand Theater, and I wanted to go back to something Bibby shared earlier when you were talking about the trauma and how some of us don't want to talk about the trauma anymore, so we get into this divide around whether we should have reparations or not. And this takes me back, I think, to DJ's earlier comment about, or question about how the arts can be used in this conversation around our history, right? Because when you're able to use the arts, like we use theater to do that, you're able to allow the story to be told without me having to tell my own painful story, and level set the conversation for everyone at the same time. And I think it's really important for us to be able to tie, past with the present, by using forms of art to do that, to give people the opportunity to step into a conversation about that without feeling like they have to be re-traumatized each and every time they hear the story, because it is tough, right? You're working on healing, and then you got to go back, right? And the only other thing I would add is that it's so important for us to be focused on the truth, because we can't heal without it. So if I go to the doctor with a broken arm and they don't use the x-ray and they try to fix it, it's not gonna get me anywhere. And unless I let them set it, right? See where it's broken and set it. So I just wanted to say how amazed I am by the conversations we're having today, and so appreciate what you all are sharing and the level of depth and expertise with which you're sharing it. Thank you.
Want to respond and say that we were supposed to have one other panelist, Jose Falcone, who is in art, and in fact was a part of the symbolic reparation research project, and a lot of the conversation was exactly on that point, how art is a part of this process, and how you can often get into these conversations without, it is, in truth, actually is a form of reparation, and it's acknowledged as a form of reparation, but that it is not just the moment of the symbolic reparation, but the process that accompanies it. And so when I was in Peru, the ojo que llora, the eye that cries, the artistic works around that statue were just remarkable. And it was all about honoring the families, but also educating the public. And so the arts is very much a part of symbolic reparations. So thank you for raising that comment.